Good evening, everybody here in Israel, and good afternoon, Brian in New York. We are delighted to have you with us. And this is a meeting again of Ma'avarim and thinking about the academic world. And today, the leaders are the real leaders are not me. But Professor Galia Sabar from the University of Tel Aviv University, who just finished acting as a president of the European College. Congratulations in the new road, Galia. And of course, Professor Brian Rosenberg from Harvard University School of Education. But things are, I'm glad to hand over to Galia. So Galia, please.
Okay, so thank you, David. Good evening, everybody. And on behalf of David and myself, we're really happy to see all of you here joining us. And I want to share something that a few weeks ago, a colleague of mine from Rupin Academic College shared your piece, Brian, and the title is Harvard Complacent. Obviously caught my eyes and I started reading, and I have to admit I don't read everything people send me, but you know, the title was really an eye-opener, and I said, wow, who's saying that sentence? And I opened and I saw that you were part of the university, and in short, you really critically analyzed the current situation in the American universities, Harvard included, saying that in spite of being the home of the most innovative minds and novice ideas, really in all fields of science, the universities themselves as institutions, so you said, are conservatives, dinosaurs, if I may say, reluctant to change, to adapt to modern times. They even reject attempts to transform even minorly themselves. And at one point of the article, you even said that universities haven't changed a bit in centuries. And you really were puzzled, and you said, look at all the other great institutions, economic enterprises and companies, they've all either changed or perished. And this paradox, and Brian, it's not only American universities, it's also in Israel, will be the center of our talk today. So as our special really guest today, we're really happy to have you. We have sent your short and modest bio. I have hardly seen a full professor with your experience that only sent a few lines. So thanks. I'll start with what I think is the most important. You're a professor of English literature, and that's a great honor to have you. As David said, you're part of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and you have served 17 years as the president of Macalester College. Wow, how did you survive 17 years, Brian? That's amazing.
I ask myself that question all the time.
Okay, great. Maybe you could share that with us today. And beyond your academic publications, you've written a lot about the present situation and the future of higher academic in America. And you're also an advisor to universities around the world about this situation. And really, just let's start with you sharing with us some of your main ideas about the situation of the current day academia, the process of knowledge accumulation and knowledge dissemination, which all of us are really doing on our everyday basis. So please, Brian, and thanks again for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I'm happy to be here. And as you say, I've had experience in academia as a faculty member for 15 years. As an English professor, and then I spent 5 years as a dean and 17 years as a college president. before coming to the graduate school at Harvard. So I've had an opportunity to look at the enterprise from a lot of different perspectives. And, you know, I've had the privilege of spending my career either at very selective research universities or very selective liberal arts colleges. And there are many things that are great about these institutions. And I would not go so far as to say they haven't changed at all. Clearly, there have been advances in technology that have been, I think, accelerated by the pandemic. I think a lot of what faculty members are doing now in the classroom is far beyond what I did when I began my career as an English professor. But the fundamental structures of the university have not really changed in decades or perhaps even centuries. That is, the fundamental notion that students come to a place where they gather wisdom from faculty members who pass on that wisdom, and that is sort of the locus of the dissemination of knowledge. And the fundamental structures through which we do that have also not changed, at least in the United States. That is the structure of academic departments, the academic calendar, the way we view the relation between teaching and research. And my observation on the basis of spending a lot of time in American higher education is that paradoxically, it is criticized all the time for being very liberal, and politically that is the case. But in terms of scrutinizing its own operations, it is deeply, deeply conservative. That is resistant to change. And much more focused on replicating what was done in the past than on truly innovating. And by innovating, I don't mean innovating around the edges, changing the name of a department, creating a new program. I mean innovating in ways that are deeply transformative. And the examples that I give in the piece that I wrote are certainly not exhaustive, but I think they're good examples. One is simply the way that we are structured. Higher education is among the most compartmentalized organizations, industries in the world. Even at a college like Macalester, which had about 2,000 students, we had 35 different majors. And we had over 30 different departments, some of which were made up of only 2 or 3 people. And I think, as all of us know, once you leave university, you no longer approach the world, the problems that you deal with, the questions you have to answer exclusively from a disciplinary perspective. It requires multiple disciplines. So why do we do this? Why do we continue to say students must major in English or biology? Why not have them organize their education in a different way that is more multidisciplinary? There are lots of ways to do that, but my experience has been that institutions by and large are unwilling even to ask the question. A second thing I point out is the academic calendar. Again, I'm not familiar with the typical academic calendar in Israel, but in the US, it has been more or less the same for at least a century and a half. And that is that these wonderful, expensive campuses are essentially in use for 8 months a year. Students show up in September, they study into December, they take a month-long break, they come back, and then they finish up in May or June. And there's nothing about that that is tied to educational efficacy. It's tied to lots of things, tradition, the desire for faculty to have time to do research, but it also adds greatly to the time and the cost for students. So why not think about a 3-year degree rather than a 4-year degree and changing the calendar? I've been part of multiple institutions at which calendar has been discussed. It goes nowhere. It dies almost as soon as you bring it up. And the third area that I highlight, and this one has been, in my experience, by far the most controversial, is the accepted relationship between teaching and research. Certainly at a place like Harvard, but even at a college like Macalester, which had a very strong research emphasis, the assumption was that the best teachers were also productive scholars. And that's the way we organize things like our tenure and promotion review process. In fact, there is a considerable body of evidence that suggests that this is in fact not the case. That there is no positive correlation whatsoever between traditional forms of research productivity and teaching efficacy. There's not a negative correlation, which is good news, but there's not a positive correlation. And I find it just profoundly ironic that those who are most passionate about defending scholarship ignore the scholarship about scholarship. And if we, in fact, take seriously the notion that teaching and scholarship are not necessarily positively correlated, what does that mean for how we hire people, how we evaluate people, and the effectiveness of what we're doing with students? So, you know, there are many, many more questions, I think, that we could ask about our own internal operations. But to me, these are examples of things that I have tried in my career, particularly as a college president, to begin discussions about. And I have to say that I can't even get the discussions off the ground. That, you know, I describe them as third rails in American higher education. You can't even touch them. And to me, there is something wrong about institutions devoted to the exchange of ideas and to the creation of knowledge, not taking a careful idea-based look at their own operations. So, so that is sort of the premise of the piece I wrote. It was in most ways directly about Harvard, simply because I'm here right now, but it could be applied to, in my view, almost all of American higher education.
Before we open the floor and David would continue, you know, this is fascinating. What were the reactions within the American academia to what you wrote? As most people who know you know, it wasn't the first time, but this kind of exposure, you know, at Harvard Magazine, what were the reactions?
You know, fortunately, most of the people who disagree with me, and I'm sure there were plenty, didn't say so very openly. It was the most responded to piece, I think, that I've ever written, with the possible exception of a very similar piece I wrote in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And I think that the sense I get is that there are many, many people working in higher education who feel the same way, but who really don't know how to turn this ocean liner, to take a culture that is so resistant to transformative change and to change it from within. And, you know, I don't have an easy answer to that. And, you know, my answer personally, and you alluded to this briefly, has been to try to go outside that system that is so resistant to change and look for innovation elsewhere. But there was a lot of very positive feedback, including from many people within Harvard, I think, who see the institution in the same way. There are many, many great things about it. We wouldn't have some of the COVID vaccines we have without places like Harvard. But if you accept that the primary responsibility of the university is education, then I think there are a lot of ways that we could perform that educative task more effectively if we were willing to look at it more critically and more seriously. But the response overall was I think pretty positive.
I'm surprised about it because you are very critical of the faculty and their interest in keeping the situation as is. I can share with you the situation in Israel, where we have so many majors, and we recruit immediately to kind of say political science degree, but this is just an example. So a student who is in political science with a political science degree would learn a lot of politics, but it does not have economics or sociology or geography or philosophy, even those kind of very close a kind of social science disciplines are not cooperating with each other. And I think, would you agree that you have to get a professor or many even retired in order to challenge this kind of system, that it's dangerous in a way, it's dangerous for young people to criticize or be too radical in reforming the system?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the way that the system is set up, once in an American college or university, once you're tenured, you essentially have a position for the rest of your life if you choose to continue it. And there's so much pressure on untenured faculty to, within a relatively short period of time, produce scholarship, impress their colleagues, get good teaching evaluations, that ruffling too many feathers and devoting too much of your time to trying to disrupt the system is very, very risky. I have to say in all honesty that the same is true at the other extreme. That is, I know very, very few college presidents who are really willing to try seriously to disrupt the accepted orthodoxies at their institutions, because they know perfectly well that if they do so, they won't last very long. The average tenure of a college presidency now in the United States is 5 years. And so people don't last very long. And people who try to enact pretty dramatic change last even less time. And so the reality is no one in the system is incentivized to change it. The change tends to come when there is an incentive to change. So, the example that I use in the piece that I wrote, if you take the example of Apple, the reason that they develop a new iPhone is because they have to. Because if they keep selling the same iPhone, they're going to fall behind their competition with Android phones and with Samsung so the iPhone 7 isn't good enough. They have to have an iPhone 8, an iPhone 9, and an iPhone 10. Within the system of American higher education, there is no group that is really incentivized to change it. Certainly not tenured faculty. Administrators, by and large, are too cautious and too afraid of losing their positions. Alumni tend to like the version of the institution that they attended, whenever it was. And students, though they might be politically liberal or even radical, in my experience, tend to be highly resistant to change within their own institutions. And so when you have a system in which no one is really incentivized to change it, it's very hard to change it from within. I think that where you find innovation in education is where people are incentivized to innovate. I'm working right now with the African Leadership University, and its founder, Fred Swaniker, likes to say that constraint drives innovation. That is, when you're in a situation of constraint, you have no choice. You have to innovate. And that is sort of the opposite of the situation of certainly of elite institutions like Harvard. There is no constraint, there is no incentive. And so it's very, very unlikely that you're going to find transformative innovation in a context like that.
Yeah.
Brian,
can I go with a comment before you, Galia? Just to finish this part of the story and really share with you observations that will not surprise you, but maybe will stick to the audience. When I entered the tenure track, my mentor told me, don't waste time on teaching. This was 25 years ago. When I moved to Jerusalem, I had a wonderful dean. I had a wonderful mentor at Haifa, but also a wonderful mentor at dean in the Faculty of Social Sciences. And he told me something like that. I know why they choose me to be a dean. They knew that I will not change anything, that I will keep things intact. So I will stop there, and Galia, you go on.
Brian, when you were speaking about the need for an incentive to change, what I have in mind right now is not a positive incentive, but incentive of survival. Mm-hmm. What we see these days, and especially in the past 2 years with COVID-19, and even before that, with all the technological advances, and companies like Google and others are having their own in-house training, where at some point people are saying that our institutions, universities, are going to be no more relevant for young people. So that is a very strong incentive, you know, the sense of survival. So the question is, Brian, are we going to hold and stick to what we have because this is what we know and not sink with the boat? Or we're going to say, wait a minute, we have to look around and open our minds and see if just for the sake of our own survival, we're going to do some changes.
So yeah, I think that is a fair assertion. I think that and I mentioned this near the end of the piece, I think that the most likely places from which you would see transformative innovation are the places that are under the most existential pressure. And I mean, in a lot of ways, one could say that about most of the institutions within the American higher education system. I'm not sure how much you know about particularly private education, private colleges and universities in the United States, but the vast majority of them are on an unsustainable financial path. They are highly tuition dependent, and they are increasingly pricing themselves out of the reach of most consumers at a time when income disparity is becoming greater and greater. And the United States is facing what has sometimes been called a demographic cliff. So within about 4 or 5 years, the number of high school graduates is going to decline by 15%. That is, we have an aging population. And so if most colleges in the country right now have trouble filling their classes, imagine what it's going to be like with 15% fewer high school graduates. And so these institutions are, you know, it's like what my old biology professor used to say about, you know, the nature of life, adapt, migrate, or die. And most colleges can't migrate, they can't go anywhere, but they're going to have to adapt or they're not going to survive. And so it does not apply to the elite institutions. They're going to just be fine. You know, Harvard this year accepted 3.5% of their applicants. Harvard does not have to worry about survival. They have a $50 billion endowment. But there are hundreds and hundreds, thousands of colleges in the United States that are in a precarious financial situation. And that's where the innovation will come from. What has been surprising to me is that even at a lot of those struggling institutions, they encounter resistance to change. You know, one of the things that I also do is provide some coaching to new college presidents. And some of them are at some of these struggling institutions. And they come in and they look at the financial picture and they say, we have to change. And even under those circumstances, there's a lot of resistance. And so even at struggling institutions, it's not easy. But there are some that are beginning to think about doing it. And again, not just by, transformative change is not simply cutting. Right. You know, what most institutions are doing right now when they're struggling financially is just making cuts. We're eliminating a program, we're laying off staff. You cannot cut your way to viability. Sooner or later, you have to take a look at your overall enterprise and say, is there some way of doing this differently so that we can be more affordable, more effective, and attract students? And at this point, the number of institutions that are doing that is still relatively small. There are a few of which I'm aware. But I think you will see more because they will have no choice. The other place, again, will be from places around the world that are in situations of more constraint, where they have no choice.
That exactly would lead me. You've mentioned that you're advising to the African Universities Union, and I myself am a scholar of African studies, cultures, and so on. And one of the great things that I found in doing research in Africa is that necessity is the mother of all inventions, and poverty, and when you don't have, you have to invent. And a lot of our new modalities of thinking and of doing things are coming from what is considered to be the margins of the modern world. And when you wrote about you being a consultant to African universities, I said, wow, are these new ideas going to come from Africa and change the way that we think about knowledge production and knowledge dissemination? And I would really like you to share a little bit about your experience working with universities in the African continent.
So in Africa, the average middle-class family, and the middle class in Africa is a relatively small group, but the average middle-class family can afford to pay about $2,000 US a year for a university. And the vast majority of people in Africa cannot afford to pay anything. It's the youngest population in the world, and there is a dramatic undersupply of seats in tertiary education. So the question in Africa, and this is again where constraint drives you. The question is, how can you provide a quality tertiary education, university education, in a context where there is tremendous demand, but there are not a lot of resources? And essentially the answer, I think, is that you have to flip the model on its head. The traditional model is faculty-centric. It's built around faculty and the assumption that you need to assemble a group of PhDs who are, relative to the African market, extremely well compensated. And then build your university around them. You have to build a physical campus, which is also very expensive. And what we're trying to do at the African Leadership University, where I'm working, is sort of flip that model on its head. So rather than building the university around constraint or shortage, which is professors, build it around abundance, which is students. So create an education that is much more student-centered, student-focused, and student-driven, does not rely as much on a physical campus, does not rely as much on faculty with PhDs, and relies on what we know about the way students learn. The interesting thing about this model is that I don't think at the end of the day it requires us to compromise and do a worse job. We might actually do a better job. There's a lot of research that shows that the majority of what people learn, they don't learn in a classroom. They learn by doing things. And so what we're trying to do is build an education that is much more experientially focused, which is also conveniently less expensive. You don't need as many professors with PhDs. So the model we're looking at, it might be described as a hybrid model. It really is important if you're doing online education to build community. And so I could go into a lot of detail about what we're trying to design at ALU, but it is a combination of community and students working on their own. It's experientially based. And right now we're offering a university education where the full tuition is $3,000. And so far, it takes on average a student who graduates from a university in Africa a year to find a job. And 90% of ALU is a new institution, but 90% of the graduates of ALU are employed, and most right out of school. So this focuses less on how much do you know about biology or political science and English, and more on what are the skills you possess, and do you have the ability to be a lifelong learner, which tends to be what employers want. Mm-hmm. And so it really is about completely upending the traditional delivery model, the traditional learning model, because look, if you told me construct a great university education that'll cost $70,000 a year, that's easy. I could do that.
Right.
But it won't work in Africa. It will not work. So it's pointless. So here we're being asked to construct a high quality university education that costs $2,000 a year. And I think we're going to come up with something. I think we're in the process of coming up with something that's really interesting. And, you know, we've got a lot of interest from places in the United States, like the Carnegie Foundation for Teaching and Learning, to see how this might be imported into the US to serve populations within the United States that are right now being tremendously underserved by the current system. It's not just Africa where there's constraint.
Right, right. Can I join your faculty? I'll be a volunteer, I promise you.
We are actually, follow up with me, because one of my jobs is to recruit volunteer faculty from around the world to work with us. So yes, the answer is yes.
You've just done that, I'm in. Okay, David, please.
Yeah, I think we may want to open the floor for questions from the audience, but I know it takes time for the audience to start and come in.
Joel has a question, David. Joel has
Joel,
raised a
please
yeah.
come in. Joel?
Thank you. This was really, really interesting. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And it provoked a lot of thoughts. I spent most of my career, I was also at Harvard for about 10 years, and then I moved to a state university, University of Washington in Seattle. So let me just say a few things. I have so many things that I want to say, but let me just say a couple of things. Universities, state universities also have difficult problems, the constraints of state budgets, basically. And you have periodic crises that come out of these constraints. And I'm thinking back to a time in the 1990s when the university had a financial crisis. And so it decided to close the Slavic department, which was a very small department, small number of faculty members, small number of students, and it thought it could save a little money doing this. Well, the brouhaha that followed was absolutely extraordinary. And not only from the professors in the Slavic department, and not only from their allies within the university, particularly in the humanities, but also they were able to mobilize publics outside the university, particularly Russian immigrants or Russian legacy people, all sorts of, and basically the university could not do it. It basically could not close that small department and save a few bucks. And my point here is that almost any institutional change, particularly powerful institutions, ones that are rich, like universities, face tremendous difficulty in any kind of change, let alone major transformative change. It's true of businesses and hospitals and anything else you can think of. And so you're up against this tremendous inertia where people have stakes in things. Now, that said, I headed for a long time and founded this international studies program at the University of Washington, which was interdisciplinary, doing just what David said is not done. It had politics, philosophy, religion, humanities and social sciences, and the sciences as well, all in this program. And it was tremendously successful. Students flocked to it, professors loved it. It was innovative and in some ways transformative. And yet the university was built on the silos of these departments. And so it was very hard to kind of, for my interdisciplinary program, but also other ones in the university, to kind of use their elbows to create more space in the university for transformation. Maybe the last thing I'll say is that where innovation and transformation has come has often been in new universities, like I'm thinking of Hampshire College, right? Not built on departments, a different idea of how students and faculty interact. And I don't know, maybe that's our hope, I'm not sure.
So Joel, it's funny that you use that example because I had almost exactly the same experience at Macalester. We had college still has a Russian department that was dramatically under-enrolled, and it was actually a faculty committee took a look at whether that department should continue, and the committee recommended that it not continue. This was a faculty committee, so this was not an administrative group. And it required a 2/3 vote of the full faculty to overturn the recommendation of the committee to eliminate a department with 2 people in it. And it would not have disadvantaged any current students. They would have taught out the program. 70% of the faculty voted to overturn their own colleagues who had studied the issue for a year on the basis of one faculty meeting where, as you say, they brought in people who had nothing to do with the college. Alumni were writing to me, how could you do this? You can't call yourself a liberal arts college without this department. And so even eliminating a 2-person department proved to be an impossibility. And so I really do believe, and you know, I have the luxury of doing this now because of where I am in my career, but I really do believe that it is easier to start something that is transformative from the ground up than it is to transform some of these long-standing, well-established institutions, which just, you know, among other things, they just have governance structures that make change very difficult. You know, think about the fact that a faculty committee that studied an issue for a year can be overturned in a 90-minute faculty meeting by the rest of their colleagues. So, you know, I think it's going to come from without. You know, my desire is that it not come from the Googles and the Amazons of the world, because I don't think their motives are the motives that I share. I mean, ultimately, they're in these businesses to make money. And I'm also on a healthcare board. I'm on the board of the largest healthcare provider in Minnesota, which is a nonprofit. And healthcare too is being disrupted in the United States from the outside by for-profit entities. And at the end of the day, I'm not sure that's going to be in the best interest of the public to have these services controlled, these essential services like education and healthcare controlled by for-profit entities. But unless the nonprofits get their act together, I fear that's what's going to happen. So, you know, I'm hoping that there will be nonprofits that are driven by commitment to the social good that begin to disrupt this from without. But right now, it's mostly coming from the for-profit sector.
David, may I one more word? There has been a major transformation in universities during my career, and that is from faculty governance being a serious element to administrative universities. And that, I just wonder what you think about that and whether that's moving us towards better transformation or blocking the way.
It's not helped. You know, I've also written about shared governance, and I don't think it's working very well right now. And you know, to put it simply, there are 2 ways of sharing. You know, imagine that you have 2 tasks. One way of sharing, which I think is what's going on at universities now, is what I would call divided governance. So you have the faculty and you say, all right, you guys do the curriculum, maybe you guys do the calendar, then you have the administration, we'll handle the finances, we'll handle this. So you have these 2 groups working on 2 separate things that are not really talking effectively with one another. The other way to do 2 tasks is to say, all right, we'll share both of the tasks. To me, that is a more effective form of shared governance. But that's not the way we've evolved. You know, we've evolved so that the faculty controls one area, the administration controls different areas, and they don't talk very effectively to one another. So, you know, our careers obviously overlap a lot. I've seen the same thing. I've been on both sides of it. And the current structure is not working very well. And so I think, again, I would describe what we have right now as divided governance, not true shared governance.
Thank you, Brian and Joel. And now Dr. Tanya Zion Boldex from the Hebrew University School of Education. Tanya, please.
Hi, thank you so much. So I have sort of a question. I just want to situate myself. I come to this conversation with two sort of perspectives. One is a sense of urgency, because as non-tenured faculty, which you described earlier, as the group that has the most interest in possibly rethinking and changing the system, but the least power within it, and the most interest to, and by the time this group gains power, it's already changed its interests. Specifically as women who are non-tenured, women, mothers of younger children throughout the corona, I think that we're at this moment within multiple universities trying to understand to what extent there is a space for transformation, and to understand the challenges of that COVID-19 has created, and how this could be a moment of change, and are being answered with exactly the kind of very conservative, no real change can happen. So that's one way that I come into this conversation. I'm fascinated to hear what you say. And the other thing is just interest, because as a scholar of social change and transformation within conservative societies and institutions, particularly religious societies, this is what I study, right? So how can change be created? So my question to you, in many of your examples, you spoke about specific colleges or universities and the internal dynamics. And I'm wondering what would happen if we think about this as a larger field, in the sense that all these various institutions of higher education are interconnected, whether it's because they share questions of status, whether it's because they review one another in for example, in processes of moving up to different academic roles. And there's a lot of ways in which perhaps specific groups or specific individuals within each community and within each institution feels very alone and hopeless about being able to create change. But if there was more thought about the larger field and how people could connect, and multiple universities or multiple colleges came together, globally even, to discuss some kind of transformation, it would be easier for each institution on its own to make these changes and to feel like it was more justified and legitimate, and for each of the individuals to gain more power. So I'm just interested in is that too innocent and idealistic, or can you imagine that happening in any way? And I'll just note that another good example of an interesting project of change is this idea of the University of the People, right, which is a non-profit American-based tuition-free online university, which is doing an interesting thing that is also of interest here. Thank you.
Yeah, and I do think that there is a tremendous amount of value in figuring out ways for individuals at institutions who are interested in more significant change can collaborate with one another. I'll come back again to the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and Learning, whose new president is extremely interested in this question. He's actually they're actually going to be hosting a hub of the African Leadership University in Silicon Valley, because they want to sort of study what we're doing. But I think that voices like that carry a lot of influence within the higher education world can take some of the pressure off individual institutions or individual people in pushing for some of this change. The other people who could really push for change are the people who provide funding. One of the things that I've noted over my time in higher education is in the US, fewer and fewer large foundations are supporting higher education. And the reason is almost always the same. We don't see impact. We give money, and the same things happen. And so if some of these large funders start to say, look, we're only going to provide funding to institutions that really have impact, that really are interested in taking this funding and changing in ways that better serve students, that too can act as a pretty strong incentive, particularly for under-resourced institutions to change. So it's going to take some voices like foundations and consortia and research groups, I think, to start putting some pressure on the overall sector and giving some opportunity for people who are interested in change to have voices. But as you probably know from your work, again, it's these conservative institutions are very, very difficult to change from within. And, you know, those who advocate for change are often the most vulnerable. You know, that advocacy comes at an enormous cost. So, you know, that's one of the reasons that I try to use my voice right now. You know, I'm in a position where, you know, I'm not in a position of risk. And so, you know, if I'm not willing to speak out, then how can I expect others who are in a position of risk to speak out? So, you know, now that I'm not running an institution, given where I am at this point in my career, you know, my goal is just to try to have impact and to try to say some things that I think many people are thinking and not many people are saying.
Brian, thank you. You know, you've mentioned the word impact several times now, and one of the holy cows within the academic world is the famous impact factor. Now, this is one of the greatest holy cows that we might also speak about. What is the impact of what we are doing? Are we impacting students, society, the advancement of science? Why are we worshiping impact factor? And that is another point that you have, you know, mentioned in your piece at the Harvard Magazine. And I think it goes back to the link between good teachers and researchers and how are we promoted and so on. So do you have any insights about this worshiping of the impact factor?
Well, you know, there are lots of different ways of defining impact, but I'll use, you know, at the end of the day, you know, why are we doing what we're doing? And now I'm thinking less of the research enterprise than I am of the teaching enterprise. You know, the research, the point of the research in many disciplines is really clear. I mean, it is the advancement of knowledge for the benefit of human beings. You know, that's why, and not simply in obviously practical areas like the sciences, but I think there is a profound value in studying art and literature. I devoted my life to it. It's not to say that every single obscure journal is necessary, but I think there is a real value to studying, you know, the most important products of the greatest minds. So research clearly has a value, but in our role as educators, ultimately, what are we trying to achieve? You know, I mean, realistically, if we're being responsible, you know, I think we have at least three impacts we want to have. A very practical impact. We want our students to be able to be employable. You know, we have an obligation to them to provide them with economic security and in many cases, economic mobility. We, I think, have a responsibility just to make them more educated people. A friend of mine who was a college president once said that you spend the rest of your life inside your own head. You want to make sure it's an interesting place to be. And it may be somewhat idealistic, but I really do believe that one lives a richer life if you have an interesting intellectual life. And then the third reason, and I think this has been particularly true in the evolution of education in the United States, in theory, and if you go back to the founding of higher education in the United States, it was people like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin who founded the University of Virginia, or what became the University of Pennsylvania. And one of their very explicit goals was to make democracy possible. That, you know, Jefferson said that, you know, anyone who thinks you can have a democracy without an educated citizenry is imagining what never was and never will be. And I think we're seeing this play out right now in very direct ways. And so, you know, you're talking about economic security, you're talking about just growth of living the more informed life, and you're talking about being a functioning part of a democracy. And so, are we doing that in higher education? I mean, that ultimately is the impact. And so, you know, the answer is, at least in the United States, not so well. I mean, we're doing okay, but if you look at the income inequality and the economic mobility of our students, and you look at the state of our democracy, it's hard to look at higher education and say, yeah, you guys are doing a great job. And so I think there's certainly a lot of room for improvement. And I don't think we spend time talking about that. I've been in my life to hundreds and hundreds of faculty meetings, as I'm sure many of you have. And, you know, the discussion is always primarily about inputs and process, but it's almost never about impact. And not impact in terms of crude forms of assessment. You know, I'm not a big believer of things like looking at how much money a student is making a year after graduation in order to judge whether a university is being successful. I think that's preposterous. Mm-hmm. But there are more longitudinal studies that we can do and other things that we can look at. But, you know, there's really not a lot of focus on those questions. You know, what are we doing at the end of the day for the students who come to our institutions? Mm-hmm. You know, we spend a lot more time arguing about whether the Slavic department should exist or not than we do about whether we're really fulfilling our responsibility to our students. And I think if we focused more on impact, then we'd have much more productive discussions within academia.
But then we have to change the promotion process as well. I mean, it has to be correlated.
Yeah, I mean, you can't expect faculty to change what they're doing unless you change the reward system.
Exactly, absolutely.
No, I've encountered this very often with experiential learning. You know, I have in my career as a college president, I encountered so many young faculty members who were interested in community-based learning. And yet they knew that when they came up for tenure, what people were going to be looking at was peer-reviewed research.
Right.
You know, not whether you collaborated with a local theater group or whether you did something with a local community on public history, that was going to be irrelevant. And who can blame them? So they were going to spend their time producing articles for peer-reviewed journals.
Right.
So we can't say we want one thing and then reward something else. It doesn't work that way.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Professor Yael Ziv wanted to ask a question, please.
I agree 100. I think I'm the oldest here. I've been in the academia at Tenure University for over 40 years, and I keep teaching even now when I'm retired. I think the question is not so much how we do it, because now with the Zoom you can share, across universities and countries and continents and save manpower if you want. I think part of the question is the what we teach. And there's a lot of redundancy, for example, in Israel, where there is a department of the history of the Jewish people and history in general, a department of Hebrew literature and department of literature of all over the world, all of these. So there's a lot of redundancy, and I guess part of the problem is personnel. And part of the problem is indeed, as you say, conservatism. We don't want to change because there are people involved. Also, I think part of the problem, you said we have to provide working opportunities for our students. I think that's not so much the issue. The med school prepares physicians. Law school prepares, teaches law but especially the liberal sciences make people more educated and open more doors for them. They then may go to particular domains. So I think the main issue is the what, and I think the what is not only restricted to the universities, it pertains to everything we teach from elementary school, okay? And I think there's where we can contribute, where we really have to rethink, and that's where I will end, to rethink what we want an educated person in our country or in the world to know, to possess, to ask, to understand.
Yeah, so thank you for that. Just a couple of observations to just reinforce your point. Clearly, the pandemic has changed the way many of us think about online learning using tools like Zoom, but I don't consider it transformative change to take the same lecture that you delivered in person and just deliver it over Zoom. So as you say, it's about what you teach. It's not just the vehicle through which you use it. The point I would, look, I spent my whole, American education, as you know, is somewhat different from education in most parts of the world. Students, at most universities don't go in directly to law or to medicine, and certainly at the American Liberal Arts College or at a place like Harvard, the idea is you choose your major halfway through, you explore lots of different things. And, I am not a believer that it's a waste of time to study, literature or art. That's what I spent my career doing. The question for me is mostly about whether we are in fact engines of economic mobility for our underserved populations. So if you think of an institution like Harvard has more students on its campus from the top 1% economically than from the bottom 2 economic quintiles. Just think about that. So they have more, what you're doing is perpetuating privilege among the same groups. For me, that shouldn't be the purpose of a university, to take already affluent and privileged people and just make sure they remain that way. It should be to lift people up who have ability and motivation and are just looking for opportunity, and give them a chance to lift them up. And by and large, in the United States, our most selective and elite institutions are not doing a very good job of that.
May I? Sorry. I wanted to respond to just that point. We had a system 1,000,000 years ago where we had to, there is a perach, a flower project among students, and I think maybe 25 or 30 years ago, there was a perach project for teachers, for university professors, where you had to help the community. We started, there were 40 of us who started. There was one who left there, and who carried it on. I was the only one who finished. And what I keep doing in my private life is I volunteer to teach. And I think that's part of perhaps instituting in some way, not on a volunteer basis, but as part of precisely to help those who cannot either afford or whose basic education doesn't let them an exposure of the type that you want to provide. You cannot address all of the populations.
Thank you very much, Yael. And I'm eager to continue, but we have to respect time and framework. And I'd like to thank you very much, Professor Rosenberg, for taking the time and speaking with us. We have this kind of taste for more, and hope to have the opportunity to host you here in Israel and this framework or another framework again. So thank you very much, and I'd like to thank you, Professor Galia Sabar, my co-host of this meeting today. It was a pleasure to work with you.
Thank you very much, Brian. And we do need to hear your voice more within the Israeli academic system. And whenever you want or we can, we would love to hear your voice. Thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. And good luck to all of you.
Yeah, and I will just conclude by saying that if you have ideas for meeting subjects, guests, on this topic and others, just contact us. Thank you very much and good evening. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.